Jeff Scott surveyed the room one more time. Everything was in perfect order, just the way he liked it. Simple, neat, and spotless. Every object had its own designated place, reflecting his appreciation for a minimalistic aesthetic. This particular clinic had beckoned him on numerous occasions. It was well known that the salaries here exceeded those at his current workplace. Moreover, the nature of the work was quite different, more challenging, perhaps even exciting. On top of that, there were ample opportunities for advancing his professional skills and career. Yet despite these seemingly irresistible incentives, something always gave him pause. Memories that felt like an eternity ago came flooding back. He remembered how his father had brought him to this small town, a place he thought he had called home since birth. In reality, Jeff had been under the impression they had resided here forever. He believed he was a native of this place. However, the truth was that Jeff's mother had abandoned him shortly after his birth, leaving him under the sole care of his father. It was a revelation that had shocked him, redefining his perceptions of his own past. During his younger years, Jeff frequently asked questions about his mother, but his father, adept at evasion, consistently sidestepped his inquiries. However, when Jeff started school, he noticed that all the other children had mothers who would drop them off and pick them up. His own mother's absence became glaringly apparent. If his mother was deceased, as his father always claimed, why didn't they ever visit her grave? He couldn't recall a single instance where his father mentioned paying a visit to her final resting place. After a week of summoning the courage to confront his father, Jeff finally decided to broach the subject during a quiet Sunday dinner. "Dad, I have a question." "Sure, go ahead, son." "Dad, why does everyone have a mother except me? And please don't spin that 'I found you in a cabbage' tale. I know how babies come into the world." Caught off guard, Mr. Albert Scott nearly choked on his food. After clearing his throat and adjusting his seating position, he replied, "Well, I've told you many times that your mom passed away a long time ago." Jeff gave this some thought. He didn't believe this story any longer. "I think you're lying to me." His father looked taken aback. "Why would I lie to you, son?" "I believe you've been lying to me all this time." "Where is all this coming from, Jeff? Is it that friend of yours, Mike, putting these ideas in your head?" "Some children unfortunately don't have mothers, and you're one of them, son. Why do you keep bringing this up?" "Dad, how come we never visit her grave? We never talk about her or celebrate her birthdays. Willie's father passed away, and they all visit his grave, even though it's far away." Mr. Scott looked confounded. He ran his fingers through his hair and momentarily hid his face behind his hand. After a brief pause, he sighed and admitted, "Okay, I lied. You're right. I've been lying to you all this time. Your mom is alive. She just can't be with us because she's moved far away. You're still a child, Jeff. Let's make a deal. When you turn 13, I'll tell you everything. Is that all right?" At the time, Jeff was only 8 years old. However, he knew his father very well. If Albert made a promise, he always kept his word. Albert was not just a strict father. Sometimes he could be downright harsh. Jeff had everything a little boy could dream of. However, he also knew that any mishandling would bring about an equal punishment. As such, he developed a deep respect for his possessions and took good care of them. Jeff agreed to his father's terms, resolving to tuck his questions away until he turned 13. He had found temporary satisfaction in his father's promise, but he was determined to never forget that his father owed him the full story. On his 13th birthday, his father gifted him an impressive audio system. However, Jeff showed no interest in the present. He gently set it aside and looked at his father. "I'm 13 now, Dad. You promised to tell me about Mom." Albert froze, taken aback. He hadn't expected Jeff to remember, let alone bring it up. Sighing, he replied, "Well, if you believe you're ready to hear it, then it's time I tell you. Your mother left us for another man. They met when she was pregnant with you. As soon as she gave birth, she ran off. I honestly have no idea where she is now or how she is doing. Frankly, I don't really care." This was not what Jeff had expected to hear. He spent the next few days in quiet contemplation, wrestling with his feelings. He couldn't comprehend how his own mother could abandon her flesh and blood. He wondered if she ever spared a thought for her child's welfare. His mind whirled with these thoughts, his heart filling with anger and resentment. His one clear emotion towards his mother was hatred. He even thought that if she ever returned, begging for his forgiveness, he would refuse to even acknowledge her. Although the conversation with his father had happened years ago, it felt like it was just yesterday. The words remained etched in his memory as if he had heard them only last night. But it was not only the conversation that lingered in his memory, something else had pierced his heart, causing him immense pain. Now, in his 30s, Jeff was a renowned surgeon. Patients sought his expertise from all corners of the country. All of this was thanks to his father, who like a gloomy cloud had hovered over him, ensuring he never missed a class in college. When Jeff was presented with the opportunity for an internship at one of Europe's leading clinics, he faced a choice: take the internship or enjoy his college life with friends. It was Albert who issued the stern warning that helped Jeff make his decision. Jeff realized that without his father's firm hand, he wouldn't have reached the professional heights he currently enjoyed. Once he reached these heights, he understood that being a surgeon was his life's calling. He felt he understood something many doctors didn't. He didn't entertain the notion of "I can't" in his professional vocabulary. He knew that if he couldn't help a patient, there were very few who could. But now, faced with a simple case of lung inflammation, Jeff, one of the country's finest doctors, felt utterly helpless. For 3 days, he tried to convince his stubborn father, Albert, to get hospitalized. But Albert claimed he was too busy, too swamped with chores and errands to spare time for a hospital visit. He kept delaying it, promising to go the next day and then the next. On the 3rd day, Jeff had a critical surgery scheduled. The patient's condition was grave, requiring his full attention and expertise. Jeff woke up earlier than usual, making sure he was fully prepared and focused for the task at hand. He often treated serious cases with extreme caution and meticulous care. When he returned home that evening, exhaustion heavy in his limbs, something felt amiss. The house was unusually quiet. Normally, Albert would be watching the news loudly on the TV, eager to share his thoughts and observations, but the house was eerily silent, save for the faint murmur of the TV anchor. As Jeff walked into the kitchen for a glass of water, a horrifying sight stopped him in his tracks. His father lay unconscious on the floor. Without a moment's delay, he dialed 911 and performed all the necessary preliminary checks to ensure his father was breathing correctly until the ambulance arrived. The paramedics arrived within 10 minutes and Albert was quickly rushed to the ER. Once his condition stabilized, Jeff arranged his transfer to one of the best hospitals in the city. After 12 hours, Albert regained consciousness, with Jeff steadfastly by his side. Albert weakly opened his eyes and offered his son a frail smile. He motioned for Jeff to come closer. "Jeff, there is something I need to tell you." "Dad, you need to rest right now. We can talk later. You need to build your strength. You'll need it, won't you?" Jeff replied, trying to lighten the mood with a smile. Albert smirked, almost as if dismissing his son's words. He looked at Jeff and smiled, his eyes beginning to water. "I said be quiet and listen." His voice trembled slightly, the words struggling to pass his lips. "Jeff, I have to tell you the truth. I will tell you everything." He paused, collecting his thoughts before he continued. "Jeff, your mother didn't abandon you. I took you away from her. I was the one who left. She married me because I loved her deeply. But she never reciprocated my feelings, son. She never loved me back." At this, Albert's eyes welled up even more. "I was in a position to force her to be with me. But after you were born, your mother lost her fear of me. She attempted to run away with you, and I couldn't allow that. Despite my obsessive love for her, my drive to control her overpowered everything else," he confessed, wiping away his tears. "I had wealth and influence. I did everything I could to prevent her escape, moving us from town to town until I was sure you wouldn't piece the story together." As Albert confessed, Jeff listened intently, without uttering a word. He had nothing to say in response to his father's shocking revelations. A silence hung heavily in the room, widening the emotional chasm between Jeff and his father. A whirlwind of thoughts stormed through Jeff's mind. Summoning all his strength, he finally managed to say, "You made me believe she was the villain. I hated her. I hated her so much." Tears welled up in Jeff's eyes as Albert quietly nodded in acknowledgement. "Truth be told, I wouldn't mind if you continued hating your mother, but I've lived with this guilt my entire life. I don't want to carry this burden into the grave." He paused, closing his eyes to regain his composure. "I've kept some photos and documents in the drawer of my bedside table." Albert's voice trailed off as Jeff, without a word, stormed out of the room. Jeff found himself sitting on the hospital steps, his emotions in turmoil. After a while, he gathered himself and started wandering aimlessly around the city. That afternoon, he entered a bar, and for the first time in 6 years, had a drink. He had been too consumed by his work-driven life to indulge himself, but he kept his drinking in check, remaining disciplined despite his distress. "Rough day, Dr. Scott?" An elderly woman, likely in her 60s, sitting a few feet away from him, turned towards Jeff and smiled. Jeff was taken aback that she recognized him. "You could say that," he responded. "You are an excellent doctor, Jeff." "Thank you." "Have we met before?" Jeff asked. He had an uncanny ability to remember every single patient he'd ever treated, yet he couldn't place her face. "Actually, you changed my life without even performing a procedure," the woman replied, bringing back memories of their meeting. Jeff laughed, remembering the incident, and began asking her questions. "So, you took my advice and stopped worrying, huh?" "Absolutely. I did exactly as you said." The woman, Monica Trainham, had consulted Jeff when she was consumed with fear that she had tumors all over her body. Instead of rushing to perform tests, Jeff had invited her to a nearby cafe. Over coffee, he had spent an hour reassuring her and suggesting that she take things one day at a time. Monica had taken his advice to heart, and the fear of having tumors had vanished when her tests came back negative. She remembered Jeff's kind gesture even though he had long forgotten about it. "Monica, I'm glad to see you're doing so well," Jeff said, his heart warmed by the encounter. Monica studied his exhausted face before offering, "Jeff, if you need someone to talk to, I'm here for you. Let me know if you need anything at all, okay?" After some more conversation, Jeff shared his story with Monica. It felt like a weight had been lifted from his chest. Monica promised to keep in touch and left him with one last thought. It's never too late to make things right. When Jeff returned to the hospital later that evening, he found that his father had passed away. He took a few days off to process the news, grappling with a storm of mixed feelings. On one hand, his father was the man who had raised him and guided him to where he was today. But on the other hand, his father was also the one who had torn him away from his mother and filled his heart with hatred for her. A week later, Jeff drove to his mother's last known town. During his journey, he received a call from a private clinic offering him a prestigious position. It was an offer most doctors would jump at, but Jeff turned it down. He spent 3 years in his mother's town, hoping to uncover some information about her. But all he found was that she had left the town a decade ago. After exhausting all leads, Jeff decided it was time to move on. Upon his return, Jeff was offered a leading role at his former hospital, a position he accepted knowing he was well qualified for the job. Suddenly, a nurse burst into his office. "Dr. Scott, we have a stabbing victim." Jeff promptly rose from his chair, striding swiftly towards the reception. The patient, a man riddled with knife wounds, lay before him. Locking eyes with Jeff, the man pleaded, "Doctor, my life rests in your hands. I have 3 little children at home. My wife, she won't cope without me." "Well, if death isn't on the agenda, let's see what we can do," Jeff responded with a touch of sarcasm. The doctor standing nearby shook his head in disapproval. "I'm not sure we have many options left. He may only have about 10 minutes to live." Jeff chose to ignore the doctor's pessimism, immediately issuing commands to the medical team around him. Within 15 minutes, he was in the operating room. A nurse informed Jeff that the patient was a truck driver who had been attacked by robbers while walking home late at night. After 2 grueling hours in surgery, Jeff emerged from the operating room, his patient's complexion healthier than when he was first admitted. The surgery had been a success. The pessimistic doctor from before conceded. I assumed we just hired an egotistic snob with connections. I was wrong. We have a lot to learn from you. You've given this man a second chance at life. Exhausted but fulfilled, Jeff ended his shift and prepared to head home. He said his goodbyes to the nurses in the lobby and exited the hospital. As he did, a young ophthalmologist approached him. I believe there is a woman who's been trying to find you. I don't know her, but she's unusual, the young doctor said without preamble. Confused, Jeff hurried back inside the hospital. Indeed, there was a woman at the reception desk. She looked vaguely familiar. Recognition dawned on him. It was Monica Trainum, the woman from the bar he'd once talked out of an unnecessary surgery. The moment Jeff spotted her, his heart sank with fear. The sorrow etched on her face and her furrowed brow spelled worry, and he couldn't help but wonder if she was battling self-doubt yet again. An even more terrifying thought crept in. What if she had received the dreaded news that she required surgery? However, when her eyes fell upon Jeff, her face lit up. It was like the sun bursting through a cloud. She practically sprinted towards him, welcoming him with a warm embrace. Jeff, it's wonderful to see you again. It's been ages since we crossed paths. I've been searching high and low for you. I heard you'd moved away, which made you hard to trace. But I was fortunate to cross paths with a kind soul here who told me you'd returned. I wasted no time in rushing here, Monica Trainum exclaimed. Jeff was thrilled to reunite with his long-lost friend, but he couldn't shake off his confusion regarding why she had been so determined to find him. Jeff, don't worry. I'm not stalking you to pester you with my incessant questions, Monica reassured him, a sparkle in her eyes. You won't believe what transpired. I never imagined my chattiness would ever prove beneficial. After you shared your story with me, I found myself repeating it to those I knew. Jeff continued to look perplexed. Monica, sensing his confusion, patted him gently on his back. Follow me. I have something to show you, she said, leading him to her car. She reached into the glove compartment and produced a photograph. As Jeff's fingers clasped around it, he was struck dumb. I can't say for sure if this is the woman you're looking for, but she lives in the nearby projects. Unfortunately, she isn't too fond of me. It would probably be best if you made your way there on your own, Monica advised, handing him the photograph. Before leaving, Monica scribbled her phone number on a piece of paper, assuring Jeff that he could reach out to her if he ever found himself in need of assistance. Stepping out of the car, Jeff noticed that the young doctor was still nearby. He turned his gaze towards her. She was a picture of elegance, and he found his eyes drifting towards her immaculate hands. He was quick to note the absence of any rings. Soon they went their separate ways, and Jeff found himself drawn towards the projects. His curiosity was far greater than his fatigue, and he had little else to occupy his time. As he rounded a corner, he detected the faint echo of footsteps trailing him. He turned to find the young colleague catching up to him. "May I accompany you?" she asked, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. Jeff couldn't suppress a smile. Deep within, he was thrilled at her offer to accompany him, even though he knew he couldn't promise her anything in return. "Of course, if you'd like to help me find someone very important, let's go," he responded, warmth spreading across his face. He extended his hand for a handshake, introducing himself. "I'm Jeff Scott." "I'm well aware," she replied with a chuckle. "After your last operation, your name has become a common term in these parts. I'm Christine. Pleasure to meet you." Engrossed in their pleasant conversation, they hardly noticed as the formidable project buildings began to dominate their surroundings. "I believe we're in the right vicinity," Jeff said, scanning the neighborhood. "How about we begin by knocking on doors? If we don't find her, we can just apologize for the mix-up and move on to the next." Christine nodded in agreement. "Sounds like a solid plan." They visited numerous residences, knocking and waiting at each doorstep. The sight of them stirred varying reactions among the inhabitants. Some showed surprise, while others appeared to suspect they were law enforcement officials. Deciding to switch tactics, they began to ask for directions. Finally, they struck gold. A busy mother juggling 5 children pointed them to a door in a neighboring building after Jeff described the woman they were searching for. Approaching the pointed-out door, Jeff knocked lightly and nudged it gently. To his surprise, the door was unlocked and creaked open. Almost immediately, a voice from within the shadowy interior invited them in. As they navigated through the dimly lit hallway, they emerged into a surprisingly bright and orderly room. Everything within the space seemed to be steeped in age, yet impeccably clean. Jeff's gaze darted round the room, settling on the woman lounging on the sofa. But what truly caused him to freeze in disbelief was the sight of a familiar photograph. In it was his father, a young woman, and a baby, little Jeff, who must have been around 3 months old. He recognized the image. A smaller version of the same photograph had been among his father's treasured possessions. Drawn towards the photograph, he paced forward, standing stock still as he absorbed every detail in the picture. His intense contemplation was disrupted by a voice that echoed from behind him. "I've spent countless days searching for you, but each attempt ended in disappointment. Albert succeeded in keeping you hidden from me," the voice from behind him started. "When I finally stumbled upon a promising lead, I hesitated. I was aware of your disdain towards me. I'm genuinely sorry. I won't make any excuses. If my presence is a nuisance, simply tell me and I'll vanish without a trace." Albert had often issued stern warnings to Mrs. Hall. Despite his threatening tone, deep down, he never intended to act upon them. It was more of a scare tactic than a genuine threat. "He harbors a deep hatred towards you, and you're well aware of it. If you decide to reach out to him, it'll only lead to despair for both of you. If you disregard my advice and approach him, you'll be filled with regret for the rest of your life," Albert had once warned her. His unrequited love for Mrs. Hall had turned into bitterness, and this was his form of retribution. Jeff swiveled around, his eyes meeting those of the young doctor, whose jaw had dropped at the unfolding scene. His own eyes mirrored her shock, his mind a whirlwind of surprise and disbelief. There were countless things he wanted to express, but each successive thought seemed to overwhelm him more than the last. Images of his father swirled in his mind, stoking the flames of old resentment. But as his gaze settled on the woman before him, his mother, the burning anger gradually transformed into sadness, sorrow, and burgeoning love. He stemmed the rush of thoughts and with newfound determination finally uttered the words, "Mom, let's go home." Jeff disclosed to his mother that his father had revealed everything prior to his death, and he had spent the past 3 years living in her town, tirelessly trying to locate her. I couldn't find you, Mom," he confessed, the regret evident in his voice. Her eyes welled up with tears at his admission, her voice trembling as she replied, "I've been scouring every nook and cranny in search of you." Hand in hand, they exited the apartment. Turning to his colleague, Jeff was ready to share his next thought. "Christine, would you be interested in joining us for dinner at our place?" he asked. Caught off guard, she smiled and hesitated for a moment. However, before she could respond, Jeff added, "You'll be captivated by our story." Jeff quickly scribbled their address on a piece of paper and handed it to Christine. "Thank you, Jeff. I'll be there," she responded, accepting the invitation with a warm smile. Mrs. Barbara Hall stepped into the apartment. The sight of photographs adorning the wall stopped her in her tracks. Her hand instinctively clutched her chest as an old fear resurfaced. "I know it's been years, but the mere thought that Albert might still be around terrifies me," she confessed. "He might have had his virtues, but to me, he was nothing short of a monster. Perhaps if I had managed to fall in love with him, our story might have been different. But despite my efforts, I just couldn't." Offering his mother comforting words, Jeff responded, "Don't berate yourself, Mom. We'll put things right. In fact, we should be thankful that he revealed everything to me. Without that, I doubt I would ever been able to believe your side of the story." Their conversation carried on for some time until Mrs. Hall felt silent abruptly. "You need some rest, son. You've had a night shift. The young lady Christine is coming over this evening, right?" she gently suggested. At the mention of Christine, Jeff couldn't help but blush. "What's your opinion about her?" he asked, wearing a tentative smile. "I liked her very much. She has a kind gaze. People with such eyes are transparent to me," Mrs. Hall replied. her own eyes sparkling with approval. As he drifted into sleep, Jeff held tightly onto his mother's hand, a moment he had yearned for throughout his childhood. He remembered the many nights he would secretly clutch a toy close to his chest, making sure his father wasn't around to see. Albert had despised any show of softness or tenderness. Holding the toy's hand, he would pretend it was his mother's comforting grip. He would also spin stories in his head, pretending they were narrated by his mother, lulling him into a peaceful slumber. Now, these memories felt surreal as he finally had the comfort of his mother's presence. Mrs. Hall gently draped a blanket over Jeff, tucking him in. She then leaned over and planted a tender kiss on his forehead before leaving him to rest, turning towards the kitchen to start preparations for the evening's dinner. In his dreams, Jeff wore a contented smile. The dreamy tranquility mirrored his longing for such affectionate kisses from his childhood dreams. His past wishes now satisfied in the peaceful slumber of his reality. Jeff was roused from his peaceful slumber by the familiar clatter of dishes emanating from the kitchen. His mother was busily setting the dinner table, preparing their first meal together after so many lost years. "It smells delicious, Mom," Jeff commented as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes, taking in the comforting aroma wafting through the apartment. Upon hearing his compliment, Mrs. Hall merely smiled, her joy evident in her beaming expression. "Mom, I've also invited the lady who borrowed the photograph from you. She'll be joining us for dinner too," Jeff explained, trying to prepare his mother for the unexpected guest. Initially, Mrs. Hall appeared puzzled, but as Monica Trainum arrived later that evening, recognition dawned on her. "I'm truly sorry about what I told you before," Mrs. Hall offered Monica an apologetic look. "No need to worry. I was quite intrusive with my questions. I owe you an apology as well," Monica responded generously. "Well, regardless of what happened, it ultimately led me to my mother," Jeff interjected, his smile wide and genuine. Approaching them, he enveloped both women in a warm hug, an air of reconciliation and joy surrounding them. Seated around the dinner table, Jeff, his mother, Christine from the Department of Eye Surgery, and the effervescent Monica Trainum savored each bite of the scrumptious meal. The atmosphere was filled with warmth and anticipation, signifying the start of a promising new chapter in Jeff's life. As the evening progressed, Mrs. Hall and Monica became instant, inseparable friends, engaging in lively conversation that seemed to know no bounds. Their chatter flowed freely, covering a range of topics from shared experiences to future dreams, creating a harmonious bond between them. Meanwhile, Jeff and Christine began to spend more time together outside of work. Christine would frequently visit Jeff's home, offering her assistance with household tasks and gladly immersing herself in the welcoming ambience of their shared space. Their companionship blossomed, building a foundation of trust and understanding. The evenings became filled with laughter, heartfelt conversations, and a sense of belonging. Through their newfound connections, Jeff's life transformed, enriched by the enduring friendships he had discovered. Despite all his accomplishments and strides in life, Jeff felt an inescapable void. He wrestled with unresolved emotions towards his late father, yearning for a semblance of closure that seemed impossible to grasp. His mother, a radiant beacon of strength and resilience, undeniably deserved an apology from his father. Jeff often found himself lost in thought, imagining what his father would have said had he been alive, to atone for his past actions. The heartfelt apology his mother deserved never came, a fact that filled Jeff with both remorse and frustration. It was in these moments of emotional turbulence that he found solace in the understanding companionship of his friends, Christine and Monica. The two women had helped Jeff in the past, their collective efforts leading him back to his estranged mother. Once again, they perceived the heavy burden of indecisiveness that was tormenting Jeff. They sensed his need for closure, a craving to resolve his inner conflict that was increasingly hard to ignore. One balmy evening, as they sat under the starlit sky, Christine turned to Jeff, her eyes filled with sincerity. She reached out to hold his hand, conveying a sense of shared pain and empathy. Then, in a voice as soft as the whispering wind, she said, "Jeff, remember that closure isn't about others. It's about finding peace within yourself. Perhaps your father may never give the apology your mother deserved, but you you can forgive him, for her, for yourself.